The photo sat on the analyst's desk in Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe for 3 full days before anyone believed it was real. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley of the British Army's Intelligence Corps had examined hundreds of reconnaissance images during his posting to Shape in Mons, Belgium. But nothing in his career prepared him for what the synthetic aperture radar satellite delivered on the morning of October 17, 1983. The image showed a single assembly area in East Germany, just 40 kilometers from the inner German border, containing what appeared to be 720 main battle tanks arranged in parade formation. Hartley's first instinct was to check for a photographic error or double exposure. His second instinct, after verification with 2 independent imaging systems, was to inform his commanding officer that NATO's worst-case planning assumptions were no longer theoretical exercises but documented reality. Within 72 hours, the photograph was briefed to the North Atlantic Council in Brussels, and within a week it appeared in classified threat assessments that fundamentally altered Western defense planning for the remainder of the Cold War. The image captured only one assembly area. Intelligence estimates indicated there were at least 70 similar concentration points spread across East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, representing an armored force so massive that its mere existence challenged every assumption NATO had made about conventional deterrence in Central Europe. The Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies had assembled somewhere between 48,000 and 53,000 main battle tanks in the European theater, with roughly 35,000 positioned in a crescent from the Baltic Sea to the Austrian border. For comparison, NATO fielded approximately 7,000 main battle tanks across all of West Germany, and the entire active armor strength of the United States Army in Europe numbered fewer than 2,000 vehicles. The numerical disparity was not 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1, but approaching 7-to-1 in the sectors considered most vulnerable to Soviet breakthrough operations. This was not a defensive posture. This was an invasion force held in constant readiness, supported by detailed operational plans that Soviet defectors would later describe as the most thoroughly rehearsed military campaign in human history. NATO commanders had known about Soviet numerical superiority since the formation of the alliance in 1949. But for decades they had consoled themselves with several comforting assumptions about the nature of that threat. The first assumption was that Soviet tanks, while numerous, were technologically inferior to Western designs and would suffer catastrophic losses in any sustained engagement with NATO forces. The second assumption was that Soviet logistics, command and control, and combined arms coordination were so poor that massive tank formations would quickly become disorganized and vulnerable once they crossed into West Germany. The third and most dangerous assumption was that the sheer implausibility of invading Western Europe, with its economic wealth and NATO's nuclear umbrella, meant that Soviet tank armies existed primarily for political intimidation rather than actual operational use. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, these assumptions allowed Western defense planners to justify force structures that were obviously inadequate by any objective measure. They told themselves that quality would overcome quantity, that NATO's technological edge would prove decisive, and that Soviet commanders would never actually give the order to roll west across the Fulda Gap. Then came 1968, and Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia with a speed and operational competence that shattered every comfortable illusion NATO had cultivated. Operation Danube, the Warsaw Pact invasion that crushed the Prague Spring, involved 29 divisions and more than 6,000 tanks moving across multiple international borders in a coordinated assault that reached Prague in less than 20 hours. NATO intelligence officers watched in real time as Soviet tank columns advanced with fuel trucks, mobile repair facilities, bridging equipment, and integrated air defense systems moving in perfect synchronization. The operation demonstrated that Soviet operational art had evolved far beyond the crude human wave tactics of World War II. They had mastered the rapid exploitation of breakthrough, the encirclement of resistance pockets, and the maintenance of momentum across hundreds of kilometers. Most disturbing was the realization that the Czech operation was conducted with second-line units from the Soviet Western military districts, units that were considered less capable than the Guards tank armies positioned directly opposite NATO. If second-line formations could move that fast and that far with such coordination, what could the elite units accomplish against a NATO force that was dispersed across a 450-kilometer front? The geography of Central Europe made NATO's defensive challenge almost impossibly difficult. The inner German border stretched from Lübeck on the Baltic Sea to the Bavarian town of Hof near the Czech frontier, creating a front that required defending multiple penetration routes simultaneously with forces that were outnumbered in every sector. The North German plain offered ideal terrain for armored operations, with relatively flat ground and road networks that could support the rapid movement of mechanized divisions toward Hamburg and the North Sea coast. Further south, the Fulda Gap represented a natural corridor through the central German highlands, providing a direct route from Soviet staging areas in Thuringia to Frankfurt and the Rhine River. Military analysts calculated that a reinforced Soviet tank army comprising 4 to 5 tank divisions and supporting elements could reach the Rhine in 48 to 72 hours if NATO's forward defenses collapsed. Once across the Rhine, there were no significant natural barriers between Soviet forces and the French border, and from there to the Channel ports was a distance Soviet operational planning assumed could be covered in less than a week. NATO's defensive concept, formalized in the 1950s as forward defense, required stopping Soviet forces as close to the inner German border as possible. The political rationale was clear. West Germany refused to accept any strategy that ceded German territory in the opening phase of war, which meant NATO could not trade space for time in the manner that had saved the Soviet Union during World War II. Every meter of West German soil had to be defended, which meant spreading available forces in a thin line along the entire border, rather than concentrating strength in the most threatened sectors. This political constraint created a military nightmare. NATO divisions were responsible for frontline sectors that sometimes exceeded 40 kilometers in width, far beyond the distance that armored and mechanized units could effectively control. Intelligence assessments predicted that Soviet doctrine called for attacking on narrow breakthrough sectors with overwhelming local superiority, sometimes achieving ratios of 15 to 1 or even 20 to 1 in tanks and artillery at the point of main effort. No defensive position could withstand that kind of concentrated firepower for long, which meant the forward defense concept depended entirely on NATO's ability to rapidly move reserves to threatened sectors and counterattack before Soviet forces achieved operational breakout. The problem was that NATO had almost no reserves. The 7 standing corps that defended West Germany, 3 American, 3 West German, 1 British and 1 Belgian, represented virtually the entire conventional ground combat power available in the critical opening days of any war. The United States maintained additional heavy divisions in the continental United States, but even under the most optimistic scenarios, it would take 10 to 14 days to deploy them by air and sea to European ports, and then additional time to move them forward to combat positions. The British Army of the Rhine could theoretically be reinforced from the United Kingdom, but those reinforcements consisted of territorial army units with limited training and outdated equipment. French forces, though substantial, were not integrated into NATO's command structure after France's withdrawal from the military side of the alliance in 1966, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether French divisions would join the battle or remain on French soil. This meant that whatever forces NATO had in position when the war started were the forces that would have to stop the initial Soviet assault, absorb the breakthrough attempts, and somehow maintain cohesion long enough for reinforcements to arrive. If those forces failed, if Soviet tank armies achieved a clean break into NATO's operational depth, there was no plan B. Soviet doctrine for the invasion of Western Europe, pieced together from defector testimony, captured training documents, and war games, revealed a level of planning detail that NATO found deeply disturbing. The operation was divided into distinct phases, with the initial phase focused on achieving breakthrough along multiple axes, using dedicated breakthrough divisions, equipped with especially heavy concentrations of artillery and engineering support. These breakthrough formations were expected to suffer severe casualties, but their mission was not survival. Their mission was creating gaps in NATO's forward defenses through which exploitation forces could pour. The exploitation forces consisted of operational maneuver groups, essentially reinforced tank divisions with minimal infantry support, designed for deep penetration operations that bypassed resistance and drove straight for operational objectives like river crossings, command posts, nuclear storage sites, and transportation hubs. Soviet planners expected these operational maneuver groups to advance 50 to 70 kilometers per day, moving primarily at night and relying on speed and surprise rather than firepower to overcome opposition. The timeline for the operation assumed that NATO political cohesion would collapse once Soviet forces crossed the Rhine. Soviet military theorists believed, with considerable justification, that European public opinion would not tolerate the complete devastation of German cities and industrial areas that sustained resistance would require. They anticipated that peace movements, anti-nuclear activists and political factions opposed to American influence would create enough internal pressure that European governments would seek negotiations rather than fighting to the last city block. The operational plan therefore emphasized reaching politically significant objectives: Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, before NATO could fully mobilize its reserves or before the United States could contemplate the use of nuclear weapons to stop the advance. This was not the slow grinding warfare of World War I. It was a campaign designed to achieve strategic decision in 14 to 17 days through the complete paralysis of NATO's political and military command structure. NATO's primary technological advantage was supposed to be the M60 main battle tank, and its successor the M1 Abrams, which entered service in 1980. The M60 carried a 105mm rifled gun and was considered superior to most Soviet designs in fire control, crew comfort, and mechanical reliability. The Abrams represented a generational leap forward, with composite armor, a gas turbine engine, and a fire control system that could reliably engage targets at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. But even with these technological advantages, the math was brutal. A single Soviet tank division contained more than 300 main battle tanks, plus another 100 medium tanks, and assault guns in supporting roles. A full-strength NATO armored division contained about 300 tanks. Soviet doctrine called for committing tank divisions in pairs or even groups of 3, at breakthrough points, which meant NATO divisions would face tank forces double or triple their own strength, and those Soviet forces would be supported by artillery concentrations that NATO could not match. American tank crews were undoubtedly better trained, their gunnery was more accurate, and their equipment was more reliable. But at some point sheer numbers overwhelmed qualitative advantages. NATO studies from the early 1980s grimly concluded that even with a 3-to-1 kill ratio in NATO's favor, Soviet numerical superiority was so great that NATO forces would be destroyed through attrition within 72 to 96 hours of sustained combat. The question of nuclear weapons hung over every aspect of NATO planning like a shadow. The alliance's official doctrine, formalized as flexible response, maintained that NATO would respond to Soviet aggression with whatever level of force was necessary, including nuclear weapons if conventional defenses failed. Thousands of American nuclear weapons were stored at bases across West Germany, Britain, and other NATO countries, ranging from strategic warheads for delivery by bombers and ballistic missiles, to tactical nuclear artillery shells and atomic demolition munitions designed to destroy bridges and create impassable radioactive barriers. The theory was that the threat of nuclear escalation would deter Soviet attack, and if deterrence failed, the actual use of nuclear weapons would stop Soviet tank armies that conventional forces could not contain. But this theory became increasingly untenable as Soviet nuclear capabilities approached parity with the United States. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union possessed thousands of nuclear warheads of its own and the means to deliver them against American cities. The credibility of American nuclear guarantees came into question. Would the United States really risk Chicago and New York to defend Hamburg and Frankfurt? European leaders began to doubt it, and more importantly, Soviet planners began to doubt it. This doubt led to a fundamental shift in Soviet operational planning during the 1970s. Rather than assuming that any invasion of Western Europe would inevitably escalate to nuclear exchange, Soviet military theorists developed concepts for a rapid conventional offensive that would achieve decisive objectives before NATO could overcome its political divisions and authorize nuclear release. The key was speed and coordination. If Soviet forces could reach the Rhine in 3 days and the French border in a week, NATO's nuclear decision-making process would be overwhelmed by the pace of events. European governments would be faced with the choice of using nuclear weapons on their own soil, killing millions of their own citizens, or accepting a Soviet-imposed peace settlement. Soviet planners bet that no democratic government would choose national suicide, which meant that convention superiority, expressed through overwhelming tank and artillery strength, could achieve strategic victory without triggering the apocalypse. The tank forces that NATO faced represented the largest concentration of armored fighting vehicles in human history. The Soviet T-55, originally designed in the late 1940s, remained in frontline service throughout the Cold War, with successive modernization programs that added improved fire control, reactive armor, and night vision equipment. More than 27,000 T-55s were produced for Soviet service, and thousands more were built under license in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The T-62, introduced in 1961, brought a 115mm smoothbore gun and improved armor protection, with total production exceeding 20,000 vehicles. But the tank that truly concerned NATO was the T-72, which entered service in 1973 and represented a fundamental advance in Soviet tank design. The T-72 featured composite armor that NATO anti-tank weapons struggled to penetrate, an automatic loader that reduced crew size to 3 men, and a fire control system that, while inferior to Western standards, was adequate for combat ranges inside 1,500 meters. Production of the T-72 eventually reached 25,000 vehicles, with the majority deployed in the Western military districts opposite NATO. Each of these tanks was part of a carefully structured force that Soviet military science had spent decades perfecting. A Soviet tank regiment, the basic operational unit, consisted of 94 tanks organized in 3 tank battalions plus supporting artillery, air defense and logistics elements. 3 tank regiments formed a tank division, giving it approximately 300 tanks plus another 100 tanks in the division's independent tank battalion and motor rifle regiment. A Soviet tank army, the formation that would conduct breakthrough operations, consisted of 2 to 3 tank divisions, 1 to 2 motor rifle divisions, and army-level artillery, air defense and engineering assets. This organizational structure meant that Soviet commanders could mass overwhelming force at decisive points while maintaining enough depth to feed fresh formations into the battle as lead units became exhausted or destroyed. NATO had nothing comparable. American divisions were larger and more balanced between tanks and infantry, but there was no equivalent to the Soviet tank army, no massive single-commander force designed specifically for operational breakthrough and exploitation. Western intelligence agencies tracked Soviet tank production with obsessive detail, because production numbers revealed strategic intentions. During the 1970s, Soviet tank plants were producing between 2,500 and 3,000 main battle tanks per year, a rate that far exceeded any plausible defensive requirement. The Uralvagomzavod plant in Nizhny Tagil, the largest tank factory in the world, operated on a wartime footing throughout the Cold War, with multiple shifts and pre-positioned production tooling that could be activated in an emergency. American analysts calculated that in the event of sustained warfare, Soviet industry could produce tanks faster than NATO could destroy them. A NATO armored division might destroy several hundred Soviet tanks in the course of a week-long battle. But during that same week, Soviet factories would produce 500 fresh tanks, and the Soviet Union had trained reserve crews waiting to man them. This industrial asymmetry meant that any extended conventional war in Europe would inevitably favor the Soviet Union regardless of NATO's tactical performance on the battlefield. The defensive preparations NATO undertook reflected both the scale of the threat and the limitations of available resources. West Germany was covered with carefully prepared defensive positions, pre-surveyed artillery fire zones, demolition targets on bridges and overpasses, and supply caches positioned to support units falling back from the border. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's military, developed a concept called area defense that relied on small mobile teams equipped with anti-tank guided missiles to delay Soviet advances, while heavier forces maneuvered into counterattack positions. The American Army introduced a doctrine called air-land battle in the early 1980s that emphasized attacking Soviet follow-on forces with deep strike systems, aircraft, missiles and long-range artillery, to prevent second and third echelon divisions from reinforcing the initial assault. The British developed specialized tank hunting units equipped with wire-guided missiles and trained for operations from concealed positions. But all of these concepts shared a common limitation: they required more time, more depth and more reserves than NATO actually possessed. The human dimension of NATO's defensive challenge emerged most clearly in the experiences of soldiers and commanders stationed along the inner German border. Captain Michael Patterson of the U.S. Army's 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment spent 13 months patrolling the border zones south of Fulda in 1982 and 83. His troop, consisting of 9 M60 tanks and 13 armored personnel carriers, was responsible for observing a sector of the border that stretched nearly 12 kilometers. On clear days, Patterson could see East German observation towers, and with binoculars the earthen revetments that sheltered Soviet tanks in their forward assembly areas. He knew from classified briefings that the units he observed were from the 8th Guards Army, one of the most decorated formations in the Soviet military, with a combat lineage that stretched back to the Battle of Stalingrad. Patterson's mission in the event of war was clear but essentially impossible. His troop was expected to delay Soviet forces for 6 to 8 hours to allow heavier American units to deploy from their garrisons and occupy prepared defensive positions. 6 to 8 hours against an enemy that would have 20 to 1 superiority in armor and could call on artillery support that would dwarf anything NATO could provide. The psychological burden of knowing that you were almost certainly not going to survive the first day of war created a strange culture among NATO's forward deployed units. Soldiers dealt with the stress in different ways. Some developed a dark gallows humor, joking about who would last longer or taking bets on whether nuclear release would come before they were overrun. Others threw themselves into training with near-religious intensity, believing that perfect execution of tactics might somehow overcome the numerical odds. A few simply broke under the pressure and were quietly transferred to less stressful postings. Officers like Patterson had the additional burden of maintaining morale, while privately understanding that many of the men under their command were not going to survive if deterrence failed. He later described the experience as training to fight the Battle of Thermopylae every single day, where you know the ending, but you train anyway, because the alternative is to quit, and quitting means everyone behind you dies faster. Soviet defectors who came west during the Cold War provided disturbing confirmation of NATO's worst fears about Warsaw Pact intentions and readiness. Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski of the Polish General Staff, who spied for the CIA from 1972 to 1981, passed along complete operational plans for the invasion of Western Europe, including timetables, objectives, and the designation of which units would conduct breakthrough operations in which sectors. Kuklinski's documents revealed that Warsaw Pact planning assumed nuclear weapons would be used from the very beginning of hostilities, with Soviet doctrine calling for nuclear strikes against NATO command posts, airfields, and nuclear storage sites in the first hours of war to paralyze NATO's ability to respond. The plan called for Soviet forces to reach the Rhine in 4 days, cross it by day 6, and be approaching the French border by day 9. Kuklinski's intelligence also indicated that Polish units, which would form the northern prong of the assault, had been provided with equipment and training for operations in contaminated environments, a clear indication that Soviet planners expected substantial nuclear weapons use regardless of NATO's intention. Viktor Suvorov, a pseudonym for Vladimir Rizun, a Soviet military intelligence officer who defected to Britain in 1978, wrote extensively about Soviet offensive preparations after his defection. Suvorov's books, particularly Inside the Soviet Army and The Liberators, described a military that had been organized from the ground up for offensive operations, not defense. Everything about Soviet force structure, training and logistics pointed toward a first strike capability. Soviet tanks carried limited amounts of ammunition because doctrine assumed they would be moving too fast to engage in sustained firefights. Soviet bridging equipment was positioned far forward because operational plans required crossing multiple rivers in the opening days of war. Even Soviet fuel storage was arranged to support rapid westward movement, with pipelines and dump sites positioned along the expected invasion routes. Suvorov argued that the entire Soviet military was essentially a loaded gun pointed at Western Europe, maintained in a constant state of readiness that could transition to offensive operations within hours of receiving the order. The tank threat reached its peak in the early 1980s during the period that would later be called the Second Cold War. Soviet conventional forces in Europe had never been stronger, with new generations of tanks, artillery, and aircraft entering service at a time when NATO was still struggling to modernize its own equipment. The Soviet T-80, which began deployment in 1984, featured a gas turbine engine similar to the Abrams and composite armor that matched Western designs. Soviet artillery had always been superior to NATO in raw numbers, but new self-propelled systems and rocket launchers gave Soviet forces the ability to deliver devastating firepower while maintaining mobility. Perhaps most concerning, Soviet operational security had improved to the point where NATO intelligence struggled to track the movements of major formations. Satellite reconnaissance revealed the permanent garrison locations and training areas, but there were indications that Soviet forces could disperse and reassemble far more quickly than NATO planners had assumed. The possibility of a standing start attack, where Soviet forces would launch an invasion with minimal warning time, became increasingly plausible. NATO responded with a combination of technological investment and creative operational concepts. The introduction of the M1 Abrams represented the first time American tank technology was clearly superior to Soviet designs in nearly every measurable category. The Abrams could engage targets at night and in poor weather conditions that would ground Soviet forces. Its composite armor could defeat the standard Soviet tank gun at combat ranges, while its own 105mm gun, later upgraded to 120mm, could penetrate any Soviet tank from the front at 2,000 meters. American crews trained on gunnery ranges achieved hit rates exceeding 80% on first-round shots at moving targets, performance that Soviet crews could not match. The problem was that NATO had fewer than 3,000 Abrams tanks in Europe by the mid-1980s, facing a Soviet force that still numbered in the tens of thousands. The ultimate answer to the Soviet tank threat came not from matching tanks with more tanks, but from developing systems that could attack armored formations before they reached the forward edge of battle. The United States introduced the Apache attack helicopter, equipped with Hellfire anti-tank missiles that could destroy Soviet armor from ranges beyond 4 kilometers, allowing a single helicopter to engage multiple targets before enemy air defenses could respond. The multiple launch rocket system entered service in 1983, giving NATO the ability to deliver area saturation fires against Soviet formations with submunitions that could destroy thin-skinned vehicles and disrupt command and control. Most importantly, NATO began deploying precision-guided munitions and standoff weapons that could strike deep into Warsaw Pact territory, targeting the massive tank parks, fuel depots, and railway marshalling yards that sustained Soviet offensive capability. These systems represented a recognition that attempting to fight Soviet tank armies in close-range engagements was a losing proposition. The only way to overcome numerical inferiority was to attack the system that generated and sustained those numbers, to strike at Soviet operational depth before it could reach the battle line. The psychological warfare aspect of the tank threat deserves attention because it was as much a part of Soviet strategy as the physical capability of their armored forces. The annual May Day parades through Red Square always featured the latest Soviet tanks, with Western military attaches invited to observe and foreign journalists encouraged to photograph the displays. These parades served a dual purpose. They reminded the Soviet population that their government commanded immense military power, and they reminded Western governments that any conflict with the Soviet Union would involve facing an armored force of almost incomprehensible size. Soviet military literature, published in journals that Western intelligence monitored closely, regularly referenced the tank armies positioned opposite NATO, and made clear that Soviet doctrine called for their use in the event of war. This was deliberate signaling calculated to create doubt in Western minds about the viability of conventional defense and thereby strengthen Soviet political leverage in arms control negotiations and diplomatic disputes. The effect of this psychological pressure manifested in Western European politics throughout the Cold War. Peace movements in West Germany, Britain, and the Netherlands argued that NATO's military posture was provocative and that the alliance should seek accommodation with the Soviet Union rather than attempting to match Soviet conventional strength. These movements gained particular strength in the early 1980s during the debate over NATO's deployment of Pershing II ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles to Europe. Opponents argued that nuclear weapons only increased the danger and that what Europe needed was a conventional force reduction agreement that would pull back the tank armies threatening Central Europe. Soviet propaganda actively encouraged these movements, though the Soviet government showed no interest in actually reducing its tank forces to levels that would eliminate the invasion threat. The fundamental asymmetry remained. Soviet tanks could reach Western Europe in days, but NATO forces could not reach Moscow without triggering nuclear war. This asymmetry gave the Soviet Union strategic leverage regardless of the actual probability of invasion. Yet there were reasons to question whether the Soviet tank armies could actually achieve the rapid victory their operational plans assumed. The logistical requirements for sustaining tens of thousands of tanks in sustained offensive operations were staggering. A single Soviet tank division required approximately 500 tons of supplies per day during active combat operations, mainly fuel and ammunition. A tank army conducting breakthrough operations would need thousands of tons of supplies delivered daily to units that were moving at high speed across unfamiliar terrain, while under attack from NATO aircraft and long-range fires. Soviet logistics doctrine relied heavily on rail transport to move supplies forward, but NATO plans called for destroying rail infrastructure and interdicting supply lines from the very beginning of hostilities. If Soviet supply chains broke down even briefly, tank units would be immobilized, and immobilized tanks were easy targets for NATO anti-tank systems. The Czech invasion of 1968 had been logistically simple because Czechoslovakia shared a direct rail connection with the Soviet Union and offered virtually no resistance. An invasion of NATO would face neither of those advantages. NATO's intelligence agencies also questioned whether Warsaw Pact cohesion would survive the opening phase of war. Polish and East German units were integrated into Soviet operational plans, but there was considerable doubt about their reliability in a war against the West. Western intelligence maintained contacts with opposition figures in Eastern Europe, who reported widespread dissatisfaction with Soviet domination, and suggested that Polish or Czech units might refuse orders, mutiny, or even defect once actual combat began. The Soviet Union clearly shared these concerns because Soviet divisions were always positioned to control key transportation routes through Eastern Europe, a deployment pattern that made sense only if Soviet commanders worried about the loyalty of their supposed allies. If Warsaw Pact cohesion fractured, Soviet operational plans would collapse because the logistic infrastructure depended on Polish and Czech rail lines and road networks. The tank armies might reach West Germany, but they would do so without fuel or ammunition, and a tank without fuel is just a metal obstacle. The other challenge facing Soviet operational planning was NATO's tactical nuclear weapons. By the mid-1980s, NATO had deployed over 4,000 nuclear warheads to Europe, including artillery shells, short-range missiles, and atomic demolition munitions. If Soviet forces achieved breakthrough and formed the concentrated columns necessary for rapid exploitation, they would create targets so lucrative that NATO might have no choice but to use tactical nuclear weapons, even if strategic escalation was avoided. A single nuclear artillery shell exploding in the middle of a Soviet tank column would destroy or damage dozens of vehicles and kill hundreds of soldiers. Multiple strikes could eliminate entire regiments in minutes. Soviet planners understood this, which is why their doctrine called for dispersed formations and rapid movement. But dispersion reduced the concentrated firepower needed for breakthrough, and rapid movement increased the logistics burden. There was no clean solution to NATO's tactical nuclear capability short of preemptive strikes against nuclear storage sites, and those strikes would themselves be acts of nuclear war. The possibility of actually stopping Soviet tank armies without resort to nuclear weapons became more plausible in the second half of the 1980s as NATO's technological advantages began to compound. The F-15 and F-16 fighters introduced in the late 1970s had achieved air superiority over Soviet aircraft in every engagement simulation, and their ability to deliver precision-guided munitions meant that NATO air power could destroy high-value targets like bridges, fuel depots, and command posts with extraordinary efficiency. American satellites and surveillance aircraft could track Soviet movements in real time, giving NATO commanders intelligence advantages that Soviet forces could not match. Most importantly, NATO's emphasis on professional training combined with the all-volunteer force structure adopted by the United States after Vietnam had created a level of unit cohesion and tactical competence that was clearly superior to Soviet conscript forces. Warsaw Pact soldiers served for 2 years and received minimal training. American soldiers served for 3 to 4 years and trained constantly. The gap in individual and small unit performance was substantial and growing. The true test of Soviet operational planning came not in Europe but in the Middle East, where Soviet-equipped Arab forces faced Israeli forces equipped with Western technology. The 1973 Yom Kippur War had shown that Soviet tank doctrine and equipment could achieve impressive results when combined with surprise and adequate preparation. Arab forces using Soviet tactics and Soviet tanks had inflicted serious losses on Israeli armor in the opening days of the war. But the 1982 Lebanon War demonstrated that when Israeli forces had time to prepare and employ their full range of capabilities, Soviet equipment and doctrine failed catastrophically. Syrian tank forces equipped with T-72s and supported by Soviet advisors were decisively defeated by Israeli forces using American M60 tanks and Merkava tanks of Israeli design. Syrian air defenses, built around Soviet surface-to-air missile systems that were considered highly capable, were systematically destroyed by Israeli aircraft equipped with American electronic warfare systems. The lesson was clear. Soviet equipment could be effective in limited scenarios, but when facing a well-trained opponent with superior technology and tactical flexibility, Soviet systems were inadequate. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March of 1985, the economic strain of maintaining the massive tank armies in Europe was becoming unsustainable. The Soviet Union was spending an estimated 15 to 17% of gross domestic product on defense, a burden that was crushing civilian living standards and preventing investment in industries that might have improved productivity. The tank forces in particular represented an enormous continuing expense, because armored vehicles require constant maintenance, crews require training, and aging equipment needs replacement. Soviet tank production began declining in the mid-1980s, not because of any strategic decision, but because the industrial capacity to sustain previous production levels no longer existed. Gorbachev's reforms included attempts to reduce military spending and seek arms control agreements that would allow drawing down conventional forces. The Soviet Union proposed mutual reductions in tank forces, which NATO viewed skeptically, but engaged with cautiously, because any reduction in the tank threat improved NATO's defensive position. The human cost of maintaining deterrence against the Soviet tank threat was measured not just in defense budgets, but in the lives of the soldiers who manned the defenses. Thousands of young Americans, British, German, and other NATO soldiers spent years stationed along the inner German border, training for a war that fortunately never came, living with the knowledge that if it did come, they would likely be among the first casualties. They conducted endless exercises in German forests and fields, practiced gunnery until they could engage targets by reflex, and studied Soviet tactics until they could predict how an attack would develop. Many of them developed lasting friendships with German civilians who lived in the border regions, people who understood that their homes would be on the front line if war came, and who were grateful for the presence of NATO forces, despite the disruptions that military exercises caused. These relationships between soldiers who were prepared to die defending Germany and German families who hoped it would never be necessary, represented the human foundation of the alliance. The end came not with war but with collapse. The dismantling of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, followed by German reunification and the subsequent dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, eliminated the Soviet tank threat more completely than any military victory could have achieved. As Soviet forces withdrew from East Germany, Poland and Czechoslovakia between 1990 and 1994, NATO observers were able to examine the bases and equipment that had threatened Western Europe for 4 decades. What they found was telling. Much of the equipment was poorly maintained, fuel and ammunition stocks were lower than intelligence estimates had assumed, and the readiness of units varied wildly, with some formations clearly capable and others existing more on paper than in reality. Soviet officers, speaking more freely as the political system collapsed, acknowledged that logistical teleches would have been severe in any invasion scenario and that they had serious doubts about whether the rapid timetables in operational plans were actually achievable. The victory was real, but incomplete. NATO had successfully deterred Soviet aggression through a combination of military capability, political cohesion, and the threat of nuclear escalation. The tank armies that had seemed so overwhelming never crossed the inner German border because Soviet leaders concluded, correctly, that the costs and risks of invasion far exceeded any conceivable benefit. But the victory was incomplete because it was never tested, because NATO never had to prove that its defenses would have held, because the technological and tactical advantages that American and Allied forces possessed were never validated in the crucible of actual combat. We know that NATO tank crews were better trained, that NATO technology was superior, that NATO air power would have achieved dominance, but we don't know if those advantages would have been sufficient to overcome a 7-to-1 numerical disadvantage in tanks and a Soviet operational doctrine refined over decades. The uncertainty remains. What we do know is that the men and women who served in NATO forces during the Cold War performed an essential mission. They maintained a defense that was credible enough to prevent war, and in preventing war, they achieved the ultimate military objective. The Soviet Union assembled the largest concentration of armored fighting vehicles in human history, positioned them within striking distance of Western Europe, and developed operational plans for their use that assumed victory within weeks. That invasion never happened because the cost appeared too high and the outcome too uncertain. The deterrence held. The commanders who looked at satellite photos showing 50,000 tanks and felt terror were right to feel it, but their response was not paralysis or surrender. It was the difficult work of building forces, developing technologies, and maintaining alliances, strong enough that the tanks never rolled west. In the end, that was enough. The threat was real, the fear was justified, but the response was adequate, and Western Europe remained free. If this story reminds you why understanding Cold War history matters, why technological superiority and Allied cohesion proved decisive, then consider subscribing to this channel. We examine the confrontations, the technologies, and the human decisions that shaped the long twilight struggle between two systems, told with the detail and accuracy these events deserve.